Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. My pleasure. Um, so let's get into it. What is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Well, it's the first comprehensive global prohibition on nuclear weapons. It's also the first multilateral legal framework for eliminating nuclear weapon stockpiles. And it's the first multilateral legal framework for addressing the harm that nuclear weapons have caused. It was negotiated and adopted in 2017 at the UN with the support of 122 states. And as you know, it entered into force earlier this year on the 22nd of January. So as Jem said, I'll be covering three topics or answering three questions. Why was it negotiated? What are its different provisions? And what effect might it have? So why was it negotiated? Well, primarily it was based on the deep concern of the international community and civil society about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So the immediate consequences of a nuclear weapon detonation, as well as the broader impacts that particularly multiple nuclear detonations would have on the climate, on agriculture, on migration, on the global economy, and so on. And there were many discussions preceding the negotiations based on these humanitarian concerns. And connected to that was a belief that the risk of a nuclear weapon being used was increasing. Another reason that the treaty was negotiated is that there had been a lack of progress in advancing nuclear disarmament. So even though the nuclear armed states were saying that they were committed to nuclear disarmament, what they were doing and what they still are doing is investing heavily in the modernization of their nuclear forces, and so moving in the wrong direction, and that needed to be reversed. And the other reason that the treaty was negotiated was the international community concluded that there was a gap in international law that needed to be filled, that the existing legal framework governing nuclear weapons was inadequate. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty from the 1960s was primarily concerned with stopping the spread of nuclear weapons while establishing a general obligation to pursue disarmament, but nothing more than that. There was a ban negotiated in the 1990s on all types of nuclear testing. There have also been regional bans negotiated in the form of nuclear weapon-free zones, but nothing comprehensive in nature as existed for chemical weapons and biological weapons and so on, other types of weapons that had been deemed unacceptable on humanitarian grounds. So that's in short why this treaty was negotiated in 2017. What are its provisions? We'll go through article by article. Article 1, and I think this is something we don't often spend time doing, but we've got a few minutes here at the start of band school to go back to the basics of what this document actually says. Article 1 sets out the prohibitions, so all the kinds of things related to nuclear weapons are there that you would expect to be prohibited. So you can never, under any circumstances, use the weapons, produce the weapons, test the weapons, stockpile the weapons, and so on. You also can't threaten to use the weapons. You can't host the weapons on your territory. And importantly, for a country like Australia and many of the European countries, particularly those that are part of NATO, you can't assist or encourage another country to engage in any of the prohibited activities. And this is an important aspect of the treaty because it recognises that the number of countries that are contributing to the problem of nuclear weapons is much greater than the 9 that actually possess them. It includes all of these kind of accomplices, which this treaty seeks to address. Article 2, when you join the treaty, you need to declare whether you have nuclear weapons, have had them in the past, or whether you possess them on your territory. So that's that kind of determines what obligations or how the treaty's obligations relate to your country. Article 3, the safeguards. You need to have in place, a country needs to have in place safeguards, which are measures to ensure that nuclear materials and nuclear facilities are used purely for so-called peaceful purposes, that they're not used for weapons-related purposes. And those safeguards are similar to the ones found under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 4, this is the article that relates to the elimination of nuclear weapons. So a country that has nuclear weapons has two options. It can either get rid of its nuclear arsenal before joining, or it can get rid of its arsenal in accordance with the provisions of the treaty. If it chooses the former pathway, then it needs to be able to give assurance to the states parties to the treaty that it actually has done what it says it's done, and that there aren't any nuclear weapons anymore in that state. If it joins the treaty as a nuclear armed state, it needs to immediately remove the weapons from operational status. It's prohibited from using and threatening to use the weapons. But in terms of actually getting rid of the weapons, that would be done in accordance with a time-bound plan. And the plan would be negotiated with a competent international authority, and it would need to be agreed by all of the parties to the treaty. So this kind of arrangement, the negotiators felt, provided enough flexibility as well as enough certainty in what would happen in the event that a nuclear armed state joins. Another part of Article 4 is that a country that has nuclear weapons of another country stationed on its territory needs to ensure the prompt removal of those weapons. Article 5, this is on national implementation. A country needs to take all of the necessary steps under its own domestic legal system to ensure that it can implement its obligations under the treaty. And so that would mean, for example, ensuring that the prohibited activities are criminalised under domestic law and so on. Articles 6 and 7 are the articles on victim assistance, environmental remediation and international cooperation. And I'll leave those ones to Bonnie Doherty later on. Article 8 sets out the meetings, relates to the meetings of states parties. So this is where all of the countries that have joined the treaty come together to discuss issues of implementation, and they can make decisions in relation to the treaty that might need to be made. So they could come up with action plans for implementation and so on. The first of these meetings is scheduled to take place in January next year in Vienna. Article 9 relates to costs. Some of the costs are shared between the parties. Costs related to the destruction of nuclear weapon stockpiles are to be covered by the countries that actually possess the weapons. Article 10, amendments. The treaty can be amended, but it's a very difficult process. International law is primarily consent-based, so you can't amend a treaty without the consent of some of the parties. They need to, each party individually needs to accept any amendment that might be made. So we're not expecting any amendments in the near future, that's for sure. Article 11, settlement of disputes. If disputes arise in relation to the treaty, countries need to try to resolve those disputes through negotiation and by peaceful means. It's very difficult to force a country to do anything that it doesn't want to do, but we can discuss it and use various judicial means as well as means within the treaty processes to try to resolve the disputes. Article 12, an important article, universality. Any country that joins the treaty needs to encourage other countries to join it. So we should be expecting all of the states parties to be out there raising this as an issue of concern with Australia and others that haven't yet joined. Article 13, signature. When a country signs the treaty, it's making a kind of a political commitment to the treaty. It's not yet bound by it. In order to be bound by the treaty, it needs to ratify it in accordance with Article 14. And we've had 54 countries ratify the treaty so far, or accede to it. Article 15, entry into force. We know that the treaty as a whole entered into force earlier this year. That means that it's legally binding on the countries that have ratified or acceded to it so far. Any country that ratifies it from now on, the treaty will be binding on that country 90 days after it ratifies. Article 16, reservations. A country cannot enter into reservations with respect to the treaty, so it can't say that this provision doesn't apply to it or this provision applies in some modified way. That's not allowed under the treaty. Article 17, duration and withdrawal. The treaty is permanent in nature, but a country can withdraw from it. This is a fairly standard feature of most multilateral treaties negotiated in recent decades. So we don't see this as a major shortcoming. Hope that no country that would be the case. Article 18 describes the relationship of the treaty to other treaties. Article 19 establishes the UN Secretary General as the depository. So he or she in the future is the one who organises the meetings of states parties and accepts the instruments of ratification and so on. And the treaty exists in Article 20, the treaty exists in 6 official languages and they're all equally authentic. So there's the treaty for you, Articles 1 through to 20, done. Finally, what impact will it have? I think I've got three minutes left. Sorry for cramming everything in so quickly. To be honest, we don't expect the treaty to have dramatic, immediate effects. The effects will be seen over time. And in particular, as more countries join the treaty, the normative impact that it has will increase. So we want this treaty to be putting pressure on nuclear armed states and other states that are doing the wrong thing to come into conformity with the new international law norm. So we think that this is going to change the calculus for political decision making in many countries. We're already seeing how it's influencing some of the debates in a number of European countries, including in the context of elections. And we hope that it will have a meaningful impact on the lives of communities affected, people in communities affected by past use and testing of nuclear weapons. We've already had a few of these countries join the treaty. Kazakhstan, Kiribati, Fiji all have people who are affected by nuclear testing. Algeria is expected to join very soon. And in the longer term, we of course hope that one or more of the nuclear states will join the treaty, and that there, as the international and domestic pressure in those states increases, they will really feel the power of this treaty and feel the need to come into the international mainstream. So there it is in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a really beautifully clear and comprehensive overview of the treaty. I really like the line, change the calculus for political decision making. I think that's definitely happening. Yeah, and a really perfect way to kick off band school, to zoom in like that on all of the provisions. It's really excellent. I noticed some of our diligent students had heads bowed, taking notes, I presume, unless they were on Facebook or Instagram, naughty students. But So now we have a bit of time. I hope there are some questions for you. We want this to be a really informal session, casual. You don't have to have a perfect question or anything. So please come forward. You can either type it in the chat or just come off mute and speak. So there is, one question from Jenny. What are the methods of disposal of nuclear weapons?
So under the treaty, a country needs to eliminate its nuclear weapons as well as the nuclear weapon program. So all associated infrastructure, it either needs to eliminate that infrastructure or convert that infrastructure so that it can't be used for nuclear weapons in the future. So a country, the first step under the treaty is to remove the weapons from operational status, but the treaty doesn't set out specifically how the weapons would be dismantled. Presumably those details would be included in the time-bound plan, but basically it's simply a matter of taking apart the missiles and warheads and removing the pit, and at that stage it's no longer a weapon. It can't be used as a weapon, and then the issues of what to do from that point on are a bit more complicated, but that's the that's it in basic terms.
I understand that. My question would be that those, can you hear me? Yes. My question would be that those countries that have ratified the treaty that have nuclear weapons and have agreed to dismantle those weapons actually verifies that as such.
Yeah, so it has to be done in a verifiable manner. At the moment, I mean, it's going to be a challenge certainly to confirm that a country has actually eliminated its nuclear weapons. There's no verification system in place at the moment. There's certainly no verified disarmament happening under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are no verification mechanisms attached to that for disarmament. And under the TPNW, the verification mechanisms are to be developed. The negotiators felt that that shouldn't be written into the treaty back in 2017, that it's something that should be worked on with the involvement of the nuclear armed state that is ready to disarm. There's the experience of South Africa 30 years ago this month, disarmed. So there are no questions being raised by other countries now about whether South Africa actually did disarm. There was a process involving the International Atomic Energy Agency, which gave confidence to other countries that South Africa had in fact become a non-nuclear armed state. It had very few nuclear weapons, so verifying it was easier than it will be for some of the nuclear armed states that exist today. But I think that those technical challenges related to verification can certainly be overcome.
Great, thanks. And there are a couple more questions in the chat, which I'll ask you to take, Tim, in the next 2 minutes before we move on to the next speaker. So I'll just give them to you all at once, and then you can decide how to roll with it. So firstly, are activities of countries connected with targeting nuclear weapons captured in the treaty, e.g. Pine Gap? The second one is, surely we should ban the sale of uranium, ? And the last one is, what are the significance of the local councils accepting the treaty in relation to Australia ratifying the treaty? So I think that's referring to the resolution at the Australian Local Government Association conference last week. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, so the prohibition in the treaty that is relevant to the activities at Pine Gap is the prohibition on assisting or encouraging prohibited activities. So Australia can't assist or encourage the United States to use or threaten to use or possess nuclear weapons. So some of the activities currently happening at Pine Gap could be seen as encouragement to possess nuclear weapons. Certainly, if Australia were to be involved in obtaining and sharing intelligence that would be used for an actual threat of use or use of nuclear weapons, that would be a violation of Australia's obligations under the treaty if Australia were to join the treaty. So I think those legal questions will need to be discussed further when Australia comes to join the treaty, I hope in the not too distant future. The issue of uranium sales. So a country, safeguards obligations exist to try to ensure that uranium from a particular country is not used for weapons purposes. If Australian uranium were being used for weapons, that would be in contravention of the prohibition on assisting certainly historically, a lot of Australian uranium was used in the production of US and UK nuclear weapons, including the UK weapons that were tested in Australia. But safeguards are in place now. There are certainly questions that we have raised about the adequacy of those safeguards. I don't know how much will change under this treaty in relation to current uranium export practices. Should all uranium sales be banned? I think we would all have, we all might have our personal opinions on that. How that's not the case under the treaty. In fact, the treaty recognises that countries can engage in non-military uses of nuclear technology and materials. So that would be another treaty that would deal with that potentially in the future. And the other question, the local governments, very, very significant, I think, in building the national momentum in Australia towards ratification of the treaty. Clearly, the federal government has failed in its duty to the Australian people to take our security seriously, to take international law seriously, to act in the interests of the global common good. And so local councils are stepping up and in a sense filling that void and creating the momentum that's needed for change. So the recent decision by the Australian Local Government Association, ALGA, to call on the government to join the treaty, I think was very significant.